Hello everybody, it's me Luca once again. I have returned with another video for you all to see. So, it seems that we've reached the last day of 2024, and to keep the tradition alive, I will make the final clock collection video of this year. This time I'll give you a little piece of info about every clock, so this will be a more detailed video than usual, because it's been like 2 years since I last did this. And there are quite a few new clocks in my collection, which I need to talk about. As usual, I'll start with this Gebr Wilde box clock, made between 1907 and 1911, or simply in the 1910s. It has count wheel striking, and it runs for 8 days on a full winding, strikes on a coiled gong on the hour and half hour. And yes, I know that I referred to this clock as a Gustav Becker in the past, but it's not. It's actually a Gebr Wilde with a Gustav Becker movement inside. I have seen a few clocks which are in the same situation as this one. And also, the gong block says GW on it, which stands for Gebr Wilde. Down below it is this 1990s Yantar box clock. It's a very late Yantar. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes with bim bam on 3 rods on the hour and half hour. And this is in fact the first box clock that I ever got, and sadly I still didn't manage to glue the piece that was supposed to be in here back on. It should have an identical piece to this one right there. And next to it is another Soviet clock. This is a Mayak cuckoo clock made in the 1960s. It uses the old version of their movement, so it has brass plates and count wheel striking. I can actually demo this one. Yeah, this thing is not going right now because it has some problems, but hopefully it will be next year. This is a Junghans loudspeaker wall clock, which runs for 8 days on a full winding. Yeah, I know, it still has that non-original pendulum. And if you're wondering why the minute hand is missing, it's not missing. I borrowed it and put it on my other Junghans loudspeaker until I'll find or make another minute hand for it. This clock uses the Junghans Werk 748, and it was featured in the 1971 catalog with a model number of 320/6190. Up here is a Junghans box clock with Westminster chimes. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it has 5 rods, 4 for the Westminster and 1 for the strike. The movement was labeled as A13, which means that it was made in the first half of the year 1913, and this particular clock was referred to as the model Schramberg 1 in the 1912 catalog. And I don't know, I honestly love the color and overall design of this clock. It's just gorgeous. And I was also able to make a silencer for it, so now I can silence this clock at night. Then right next to it is another Junghans. This is my first Junghans hanger clock, which was made sometime between 1961 and 1962. It uses the Junghans Werk 274/210, runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and half hour on a membrane gong. And this clock is the model number 265/7446. What do we have here then? What is this? Oh yeah, another Junghans. This is my Junghans long case clock, which was made in October of 1928, and ironically the whole case is missing. I only have the movement, the pendulum, the weights, the chime rods, and this top bit of the case, which somehow remained. And it actually has a label on it, which says that this clock once stood in a shop in Nuremberg. This clock runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and half hour on 5 rods with Bim Bam. And it's also really quiet because it doesn't have the resonance that it used to have in the case. But I am planning to make a new case for it, since it takes a lot of space on the wall, and I have a few other clocks that I need to hang up here. And here's a better look at it. Up next we have, drumroll please, ta-da! Another Junghans. This time it's an early one, which was made in the very early 1890s. This is what I would call a transitional clock, because it has a very weird and early movement, and the Junghans trademark, which was registered in 1890, or in the very early 1890s. The whole movement is mis-centered and was fitted into the case so that the dial would be in the center. It's very weird. I think it either runs for 8 days or 30 hours, sorry. I haven't tested it for that long yet. And it strikes on the hours and half hours with, well, not with, on a coiled gong actually. Sorry, I really can't speak today. And next to it is a quartz clock, a very early one. I've had this clock for like 8 years. And then there's this. This is a 31-day Korean wall clock made by Rollens, which strikes on a coiled gong on the hour and half hour. And it uses a very typical Korean 31-day movement. It's nothing special really. And it was made in the 1970s, I'd say. Then under those we have a trio of cuckoo clocks. Well, this one doesn't really belong here because the other one is in my room. This is part of a very special project which I plan to complete next year. I truly hope I will be able to complete it next year, because it will be the first time when the two different personalities of Luca will combine into something. So it's gonna be very cool. And next to it is a Black Forest cuckoo clock made in the 1950s, I'd say. It's completely unmarked, and it runs for 24 hours on a full winding. What else can I say about it? Oh yeah, the decorations are still broken, and the high note bellow as well, because this clock fell off the wall this summer or last summer, sorry. I can't really remember. And next to it is a Victoria Arad cuckoo clock made in the 1970s in Romania. It runs for 24 hours on a full winding, and it has a Graham's deadbeat escapement, which is not common for a cuckoo clock. Moving on, here's my Vedette transistor Atomat wall clock, which was made sometime in the 1970s. The oldest repair date that it has is from 1979. It runs for as long as the battery isn't dead, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on 2 rods with Bim Bam. And actually the movement was made in Japan by the Rhythm Clock Company. And underneath is my Odo Jacquemart wall clock, which was made sometime in the 1940s, I believe, or maybe later. It runs for either 8 or 14 days, I haven't tested it, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a single rod. And it also has a very pretty color. Down here is my only OG clock, which was made by the New Haven Clock Company, even though the label inside says Jerome and Company. It runs for 30 hours, and it has a very pretty painting here on the bottom glass, which represents the Westminster Abbey. And here is an unfinished project. This is my PTT office clock, which was made by J.G. Baer, or Bayer, like B-A-E-R. I will just pronounce it the way I pronounce it in Romanian, like Bayer. In Switzerland, in Sumiswald to be precise. About 1929, it has a time-only movement, and it runs for 14 days, I believe. And it's still in bits, because I need to take care of the case. And those wires came from my electrovedette. That thing in there is my cuckoo quail clock, which was made by Hubert Hea in Germany in the 1960s, I believe. It runs for about 30 hours on a full winding, and it's still dismantled because I need to clean the decorations and the case. However, the movement has been serviced and it runs perfectly. And it's also missing the bellows, so I'll need to find replacement ones. Aside from the quail bellow, which somehow survived, and I still have it. And yet another project clock. This is a Korean 31-day wall clock, which was made by a company called Jackie sometime in the 1970s or 1980s. It does have a calendar in there, and a very, very weird movement, like look at this. You could consider this a triple plate. And it's not running right now because the calendar control arm is broken, and it also runs insanely fast, so I'll have to do something about that. And in my parts closet are two clocks, which have no place on the wall right now because I don't have any free nails. This is my Zuawerk. It's a shield clock made in the Black Forest in the 1870s or maybe even the 1890s. It has a grand sonnery movement with only 2 weights. And down there is my antique cuckoo clock made sometime in the late 1890s or maybe even the early 1900s. The movement is completely unmarked and it runs for 30 hours on a full winding. Same for this clock. And since I talked about all my other clock projects, here's the case of my third Yantar box clock. The movement has been dismantled to bits because the time side mainspring barrel literally exploded, and I'm not even kidding. Up here are 2 clocks very different from each other. The small one is my Junghans Electrogong, which was made sometime in the 1970s. I honestly have no idea when it was made. Even though I said in the original video that it was made circa 1965, I actually found a clock which is an almost exact match in the 1971 catalog. The model number 348/3017. And this thing uses the Junghans Werk 701.05. And behind it is another Yantar box clock, which was made in 1976. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour with bim bam on 3 rods. And in case you're interested, here's another clock project. This is my Philip Haas tall-shaped clock, which has finally returned home after about, like, I don't know, 4 years of absence. This thing has been at my local clock shop during all this time, and they still haven't fixed it. So I took it home to fix it myself. Here's a nice bracket clock with a quartz movement made by Junghans. And down here are 6 Chinese alarm clocks, which were made by different manufacturers, but they still share the same movement, with different beat rates, because this one beats faster than all the other 5. That is a horrible German mantle clock, which presumably has a butchered Maute movement in it. I don't even want to talk about it. Here is my Gustav Becker spare movement. And this is my Hermle cast iron wall clock, which was made in 1974. It has no space on the wall right now, so it's gonna stay in here. And it also runs for 8 days and strikes on a bell. Behind it is my Keininger mantle clock, which runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it runs insanely fast. The only thing which I can try to do to fix this is go ahead and demagnetize the platform, because that's the only thing which I think it's possible to cause this. Here's my Victoria Arad box clock, which was made in the 1970s in Romania. It runs for 14 days on a full winding. It has a time-only movement, an open mainspring, and a Vienna deadbeat escapement. It's actually a pretty good timekeeper for what it is. And behind it is my Pragotron slave clock, which is not going right now because I have no master clock to connect it to. And on the other side is another Junghans hanger clock, which I recently got. It was featured in the 1959 catalog with a model number of 265/3784. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, strikes on a membrane gong on the hour and on the half hour, and it uses the Junghans VEAC 274/210. And here are all of my alarm clocks. There is no way I'm going in depth on every clock here, but mainly here are clocks from Romania, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, the USSR, and maybe a few other countries. And then there's a bunch of quartz clocks which I have. Moving on to my mini bookcase here. This is a small mounted desk clock which runs for 8 days on a full winding. This is my Junghans bracket clock, which was made in 1905. The movement is marked B05, so yeah. It runs for 30 hours on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour, on a coiled gong. And here's another Junghans. This is a huge Junghans desk clock, made sometime in the 1960s. It's not going right now because one of the pinions is broken, and it runs for 8 days on a full winding. Here's my Gerard mantle clock with Westminster chimes. It was made in England in 1944, as this small dedication says here. This clock was given to a guy in May 1944 as a gift. It has 5 rods inside, and it uses 4 of them for the chimes and 3 of them for the strike. It strikes on 3 rods, and it runs for 8 days on a full winding. Then here's my Junghans carriage clock, which actually strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a bell. It runs for 30 hours on a full winding, and it was made in 1910. Then there's this small French alarm clock. It's a travel alarm clock made in the 1870s. It has no balance wheel. It actually has a short pendulum inside, and it runs for 2 days on a full winding. And behind all of these is my Mayak desk clock, which was made in the USSR. It has a very nice case, and it runs for 8 days on a full winding. On the shelf below is a trio of mantle clocks. This one could be considered one of the centerpieces of my collection. It's a Junghans mantle clock made in 1958. It has a model number of 16/5077, and the case is covered entirely in a plastic material. That's what it says in the catalog, but the texture feels like leather. That's why I've been calling it the leather-covered mantle clock since I got it. So this is literally a purse, but with a clock inside. It uses the Junghans VEAC 274/210, runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a membrane gong. Then next to it is a 1968 Dujena mantle clock. It's very small. It uses an FHS movement. Sorry, I really can't speak. And it runs for 8 days on a full winding. It has a floating balance, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on 3 rods with Bim Bam. Then this is my HEC Art Deco mantle clock, which was made in the late 1930s or the early 1940s. It has a Junghans Werk 77/400 movement inside, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour with Bim Bam on 3 rods. It runs for 8 days on a full winding. Here's a very big Junghans mantle clock, which was featured in both the 1958 and the 1959 catalogs, with a model number of 17/5944. It runs for 14 days on a full winding. It has a Junghans Werk 278/201 inside, and it also strikes on the hour and on the half hour on 5 rods with Bim Bam. Up next is my Atlanta desk clock, which uses a Hermle movement made in 1977. This is a motor strike and wind clock. That's what I would call it, because this clock is being wound by a motor while it strikes. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention that it strikes on 2 bells with Bim Bam. And down here is my Ansonia mantle clock, which was made in the 1920s, I believe. I have no idea when this was made. I am no expert in American clocks. It has a very weird shape. It's a clover-shaped clock. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, or that's what I believe. I have no idea. And it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a coiled gong. And here are the last 2 clocks from my clock room. The small one is a Perfecta mantle clock, which I have no idea where, when, and who made it. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it has a time-only movement. And behind it is a Hermle mantle clock, which runs for 8 days on a full winding. It has an early movement, which is not marked, so I assume it was made in the mid-1960s, or maybe the early 1970s. And it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on 3 rods with Bim Bam. Moving over to my room, here is a small 1940s Kinsley box clock, made in Germany. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on 3 rods with Bim Bam. Then next to it is my 1940s Giraud box clock, made in France. It runs for 8 days, and it has 8 rods, 4 for the chimes and 4 for the strike. It's a dual chime clock. It plays Westminster and bells of Jura. The chimes are not working at the moment because the spring broke on Christmas Eve. And if you're wondering why there's a piece of tape in there, this clock has no locking mechanism, and when it strikes or chimes, the door opens a little bit like this, and I hate it. So that's why I put a small piece of tape in there to keep it shut until I'll make a locking mechanism for it. Down here is my Electrovedette, which was made sometime in the 1930s or the 1940s. It uses the first version of the self-winding movement. There's it going. So yeah, as I was saying, it uses the first version of the movement with the constantly running synchronous motor. Or not really the first version, the first variation, I should say. And ironically, the electrical bit isn't working right now because I have to redo the wiring and find the plug for it, so it's not an Electrovedette. It's just Vedette for now. And until I'll get that sorted, I'll wind this clock manually. The hole in the dial was made by the previous owner, and that leads to the single winding arbor, because this clock winds all 3 mainsprings at the same time. As you heard before, it plays the Westminster chimes on each quarter, and it has 8 rods. This is undoubtedly one of the centerpieces of my collection, and I love it. Then here's my big Victoria Arad alarm clock made in Romania in, wait, let me check, 1970. It has 5 different functions. It displays the time, has an alarm function, a music box, a date window, and a small light bulb, which helps reading the time at night. Yeah, it works most of the time. And I think it runs for about 2 days. Below it is this huge Hermle mantle clock with Westminster chimes. The movement is unmarked, so I assume it was made in the early 1960s. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it has 5 rods. 4 for the chimes and 3 for the strike. And here is my trusty wristwatch, which I'm not wearing right now. This is an Orient, made in Japan, and it has 22 jewels. Here's my small Hubert Herr cuckoo clock, which was made in the late 1990s or the early 2000s. It runs for 24 hours on a full winding, and it also retained the original sticker from the Black Forest Cuckoo Clock Association. Here's my Yantar desk clock, which was made in the 1970s or the 1980s in the USSR. It uses an automat movement, which caused me quite a headache about 2 years ago. I can't even remember. And the main thing that attracted me to this clock is this calendar that it has. It has a date window and the days of the week in Romanian. So that's quite unusual. And next to it is this beautiful Austrian mantle clock made in the early 1900s. There's it going. Yeah, this thing runs for 14 days, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a coiled gong, which sounds like a Gustav Becker Gloria gong. And if you couldn't tell, the case is just amazing. Like, look at it. This is the main reason why I brought it into my room. Up here on the wall is my Seiko Melodies in Motion wall clock. It's the collector's edition from 2006, and it plays 8 melodies. It sadly doesn't have any batteries in it at the moment, so it's only displaying the time. And here's my trusty alarm clock, which wakes me up every day during school. It's a Slava made in the USSR in the 1970s or maybe even the 1980s. It has 11 jewels in it, and this thing basically has an upscaled watch movement in it. It's very nice. Like, I love the color, and it's also a very good timekeeper if regulated properly. And here's my best friend, so to say, which is being guarded by this plushie every day. It's a Junghans loudspeaker wall clock made in 1963. It has a model number of 20/6162. It runs for 8 days on a full winding, and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a membrane gong with 3 rods. There's also this little guy. which is a miniature of a street clock, which, I don't know, it's basically just a quartz clock, which you can set to different time zones. And I wanted to get it because it looked like a street clock and it looks funny. It's very small and cute. And here's the last clock, which I have to show you. My Carl Werner Vienna style wall clock. Made in the early 1900s or the late 1890s. It runs for 14 days and it strikes on the hour and on the half hour on a coiled gong. It's also probably the best timekeeper that I have in my collection. And the minute hand is missing because I borrowed it and put it on my other Junghans loudspeaker. This is a Junghans wag on the wall clock with loudspeaker, or a loudspeaker. No. This particular clock is the model number 3. No. And this particular clock is the model number. Wait, let me remember. 265/74. I can't read that far, sorry. And I forgot. I freaking forgot the movement number. Oh my god. And a very weird movement. Oh, I can't speak. It runs for as long as the battery isn't dead. And wait, I forgot what I wanted to say. It runs for about 6... And since I talked about all my... which uses the Junghans Werk 701.05, sorry, I really can't speak. And I sadly don't know it... the small one is my Junghans Electrogong, which uses the... And here's my best friend, so to say. And behind it is my Junghans bracket clock, which was made in 1905. I'm stupid. And so we've finally reached the end, and you've seen my clock collection in all its glory. Holy crap, that thing took so long to make. It took me like 3 hours because I'm blabbering quite a lot and I cannot speak English today for some reason. I don't know why. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it because that thing took a lot of time to make. Trust me. And yeah, what else can I say? Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll make a Happy New Year video this year because I have some friends coming over. And I have no idea if I'll be able to do that, but we'll see. So yeah, that's kind of it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Happy early New Year, everybody, and I was Luca. So we'll see each other in 2025. Bye bye.